Okay, I'll get that up when I get it up.
Good evening. I'd like to call this public meeting to order, please. Okay, I'd like to call this public meeting to order, please. Will you take your seats? Where's my gavel?
Tough crowd tonight.
All right. Thank you. Very rarely I have to use that gavel, so it's great to see such an engaged audience this evening. Okay, so we're here tonight for a public meeting on the Regional Development Charges Bylaw Review. An agenda has been circulated. Is there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, okay, thank you. So, as mentioned, this is a public meeting, and as such, there's certain procedures we have to adhere to as per the Municipal Act. I'm just going to detail what those procedures are going forward for this evening and how we're going to deal with the report in its conclusion. So this is a public meeting where all members of Regional Council are involved. The Regional Municipality of Waterloo is reviewing its development charge bylaw under the terms of the Development Charges Act. The region's current bylaw expires on July 31st, 2019, and the region is now required to complete a background study, which many of you have seen, hold public meetings, and enact a new bylaw. The purpose of the regional development charge is to recover certain growth-related capital costs from residential and non-residential development. The region provided public notice about this meeting and met the required 21 days advance notice by placing advertising in local newspapers and promoting on the regional website. We are interested in receiving input and listening to the delegations. I just want to emphasize that no decisions will be made this evening. We're here to listen to the public, industry stakeholders. We'll take that information back, and then a staff report will be prepared for the June 18th Administration and Finance Committee meeting, and a final decision will be made during the June 26th Council meeting. So at June 18th meeting, a recommendation will be put forward. The committee will do what it may with that recommendation, and then whatever happens at committee meeting will go to June 26th for a final decision and pass a new bylaw. So there's a couple of additional things I'd like to share with you tonight. We scheduled an hour for the meeting, and we have 16 delegations at approximately 10 minutes each. So quick math, we'll be here likely longer than an hour. And we have a regional council meeting scheduled for 7 p.m. So what we're going to do is we're going to carry on with our public meeting, and then at 7 o'clock we'll suspend the public meeting for a special council meeting to deal with an LRT ION related report. We'll deal with that report, and then we'll reconvene this public meeting, and then after the conclusion of this public meeting, we'll continue with the rest of the council meeting. Does everyone understand what's going on? All right, that's great. So thank you very much, and with that, I'd like to move through our agenda and ask Mr. Dyer, our treasurer, to make a few opening comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have too much to say at the outset of the meeting before we start moving through a brief presentation and then the delegations. But I did want to make mention of the fact that Bill 108, as many of you know, was introduced last week. And if enacted, that bill does propose a number of changes to the Development Charges Act. Staff are reviewing that bill, having discussions with the province, and we'll see how that process evolves over the next few weeks. Our intention will be to bring a staff report to the next Administration Finance Committee, which will be on May the 28th. And at that point, we're anticipating now that report will provide input and comments to the province on the proposed changes to the Act. And if any changes to the process that Chair Strickland just laid out, if any changes to that process are necessary, we'll try to articulate that as part of that report as well. And so with that, I'd like to ask Gary Scandlan from Watson and Associates to come and make just a brief presentation on the background study and the proposed rates. The region engaged Watson and Associates in the early part of last year to complete the background study. The background study was released back on April 23rd, is available on our website if you haven't seen it yet. And Gary's going to give us a brief overview of that study before we move into the delegations.
Okay, welcome, Gary.
Thank you. As noted, I'm going to do a presentation. I will move through quickly. I understand there's lots of people that want to speak tonight, so we'll move quickly through. You've done a good job, Mr. Chair, of summarizing the process. The one thing I want to point out is that there were changes to the Act that identified a minimum 60-day circulation between the time that we release the background study and the first that Council can consider the bylaw, and we've more than met that time horizon in this process. In addition to this public discussion tonight, you can see that we've met with a number of groups. There was a stakeholder committee, which there was area municipal group. We met with all the area municipalities. There was individual developers and groups that we met with through the process. You've summarized the public meeting quite well so as to receive public input with respect to the policies and the charges that have been included in the background study. You've highlighted the process as well, so I won't go back over that. Development charges are to recover growth-related capital costs for both residential and non-residential growth. To highlight the costs, the Act actually breaks development capital costs into two different segments. One which is very localized services. The Act calls it local services, and that really says that within developing landowners will basically pay for the very localized work such as internal roads, water mains, sewers, street lights, sidewalks, etc. The Development Charges Act are to pick the broader costs that are, for the most part, outside the area to which those subdivision plans relate. Historically, there's been adjustments to the bill. The Treasurer, Craig Dyer, highlighted there's another change that we're going through. But historically, it used to be a 100% cost recovery mechanism. As we've moved through time, you can see that they've introduced a number of different reductions in services, deductions, and within the calculations, limitations on what we can collect. So they're not full cost recovery. Development charges basically recover somewhere within the 75 to 80% of the capital cost of growth. This just highlights at a very high level, the process we go through. We identify the type, amount, and location of growth. We then take a look at the servicing needs and identify capital projects to satisfy those needs. There's a number of deductions that we're mandated to make adjustments to those capital costs. And after that, we end up with a net cost, which is then allocated between residential, non-residential growth, and then divide those costs by the growth that was identified. And as I say, we come up with the charge. As I've noted, the local service policies are very localized. The local services are very localized costs that the developers, for the most part, will pay 100% for. There is a local service policy that we've provided within the background study that helps to identify specifically what the requirements of the developing landowner will be and what costs have we included in the development charge. And you can see we've highlighted at a very high level the types of items that are included in the local service policy. I've noted there's mandatory exemptions. There's not many. For the most part, intensification of industrial, some intensification of residential development, and there's a local government exemption. So the region wouldn't impose it on the lower tiers or the school boards, and vice versa. Those agencies wouldn't impose a charge on a regional facility being constructed. There are opportunities for the council to make further refinements to make it a Made in Waterloo bylaw. So the policies allow you to reduce the charge wholly or partially for different types of development, different classes. The charges are increasing significantly. We could phase them in over time. And then lastly, just to recognize that if you're redeveloping a site, say you're knocking down 3 single-family homes, building 10 townhouses, you'd get a credit for what was there before. So we would charge 10 times the townhouse rate, subtract 3 times the single-family. So those provisions are included in the bylaw, or the redevelopment credit is included in the bylaw along with other policies. The challenge of council, development charge bylaws are not mandatory, but they're a tool that's provided by the province to assist municipalities in paying for the growth-related infrastructure. At the top, it just acknowledges that as growth occurs, so does the need for additional infrastructure. Water treatment plant, sewage treatment plant, the pipes, pumping stations, additional roads, at the local levels, additional fire departments, parks, recreation. All of these services tend to, the pressure builds as the growth occurs. And the bottom two just identify that, the development charges allow you to collect a certain portion of those costs, as I've noted, generally in the range to 75 to 85%. But any of those costs that aren't recovered end up going on to property taxes and going on to your water and sewer rates. If you chose not to have any development charges, then the full cost of building that infrastructure would be the property tax and sewer water rates. I apologize for the size of this table, but it just tries to summarize all of the charges that are in place right now within the cities. If you have a single detached unit, you'd be paying just under $23,000 a unit. And within the townships, you'd be paying just over $19,000 for a single detached unit. Moving across, you can see we have single and semi-detached rates, multiples, which are your medium density, townhouses, if you will, and then apartments being the smallest rate. And as we move across, those charges reduce as the size of the units actually reduce. We then have non-residential charges, which are there for commercial, industrial, institutional. The municipality breaks their charges currently into industrial and non-industrial. And you can see the current industrial charge, say within the city, is $6.09 per square foot of building space and $5.11 in the townships. And then it's much higher in the cities, being $12.18 in the cities, $10.22 in the townships. The services that we've included through this process are basically the same services that were included last time around. And you can see that region-wide charges are those charges that it doesn't matter if you're in the urban areas or the rural areas, you will pay the exact same charge for those region-wide services. Then we have urban area services, so water and wastewater. If you're receiving those services, you have those charges which will be paid. And then cities, there's an additional charge for transit. And in the townships, there's an additional charge for just libraries. These are the updated rates. Once again, I apologize for the size, but I'll do a comparison in a moment. You can see once again that the charges decline as we move across from large units into smaller units. I'd identify that we've added an additional category called lodging units, for the most part to pick up those special types of units where you might have a seniors development, such as a Chartwell, for example, and they would have a very low occupancy for each of the units that they provide. So we've added an additional category in this regard. And on the non-residential, you can see that we've undertaken a calculation, which right now we've just called non-residential. So this is a blended charge for commercial, industrial, and institutional. I would point out that in one of the appendices within our report, where there are discussions that we are having whether we vary this rate by different class. Do we do it industrial versus non-industrial? Do we do retail versus non-retail, et cetera? I'd invite you to take a look at that analysis and the discussion. There will be further decisions made before we complete this process. So comparing the charges, this one makes it a little bit easier to see. You can see that for the cities, the current charge is $22,600 for a single detached unit, and the calculated charge at this point is just a titch over $28,000 a unit. Within the townships, it's currently at $19,300, and we've calculated a charge of $25,600. On the non-residential side, similar type of calculation. You see the cities at $12.18, and our new calculated charge is at $16 per square foot. Within the townships, $10 per square foot, going up to $14 per square foot. Just trying to give you a broad comparison of different municipalities in different areas. We've included a cross-section which would include all the way down the highway to Ingersoll in the west, and then moving right across to Vaughan and Mississauga and Brampton in the east. You can see the current charges right now are in the red, and then the proposed charges are in the yellow. Comparatively, the positioning of the charges relative to the east and the west is, for the most part, very, very similar. When we take a look at the, that's per single detached. So this is, we were asked to provide a medium density comparison as well. You can see that the charges are very similar to the comparison of the last chart. And when we take a look at apartment units, once again, very similar in positioning relative to the other surveyed municipalities. Non-residential for commercial, you can see that we're at the lower end, so we're to the left-hand side of this comparison. And if we take a look at industrial, very similar type of comparison. The calculated charges, however, are move substantially because prior to the municipality had discounted the calculated charge for industrial by 50%. What's included in here right now is the calculated rate, just like it was the last time. I think the calculated rate was around $12 for industrial, and it was reduced by policy to $6. This charge right now is calculated at $16. And as I say, council is still yet to decide what options they wish to deal with on the industrial side. So this is under discussion right now, but this is the calculated rate, and we'll see how council deals with policy adjustments if that's their will. Things that are being considered by the steering committee, brownfield programs. So how do we deal with brownfield redevelopments? Should there be geographic exemptions? Historically, if municipalities have had the downtown core exemptions, the region has followed those policies. We're looking to see whether any or all of those policies would continue. Redevelopment allowance, area rating, and non-residential rate structure, as I've touched on, are also under discussion right now. I noted that at the back of the document, there are what we're considering for different options for non-residential, and you can see we've summarized them here. Along the bottom, this is the current charge as was calculated. You can see the footnote for industrial with the former bylaw discounted industrial by 50%. So right now we're looking at a uniform rate, the potential of a retail versus non-retail rate, an industrial versus non-industrial rate, or an individual rate for industrial versus commercial versus institutional. And you can see the corresponding rates are there for your consideration. The townships, this is the first one was the city, and this is the corresponding calculations for the townships. But once again, it follows the exact same categorization of options. Next steps, as was noted, there's no consideration of the bylaw today. There's just at the public meeting, we're receiving input, and subsequent to this, council will be provided with a staffing report, and the bylaw will seek to be considered on June 26th. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any questions of council, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Appreciate that comprehensive overview. There are no questions from council. We do have a question. Councillor Vanovic.
That probably more for staff than the delegation, and it's just with respect to the dates that are being proposed here.
Okay, so we'll just hold that in abeyance for a second. Any questions for Gary? All right, thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you.
All right, so Councillor Vanovic, the dates?
Yeah, so presumably, I guess we'll be seeing the report, and the community will be seeing the final proposed report on June 18th for the first time. And we'll be looking to be passing the bylaw a week later. I'm just wondering what the implications are if we need more time in between that to have further discussions and negotiations with the community.
Oh, I think that this is a targeted plan, and in our deliberations, if we decide that we need more time, I think more time could be accommodated. Mr. Dyer?
Certainly through you, Mr. Chair, the dates that are shown here are the scheduled committee and council dates in June. If committee's determination or council's determination on either of those dates is that additional time is needed before making a decision, then an additional meeting of committee and or council could be scheduled.
So that would be presumably in July, or is it
Presumably in July.
meeting, or?
Presumably in July. The current bylaw expires on July 31st.
Okay, so it needs to be
So
before
it needs to happen in July
Okay,
at the latest.
thank you.
Okay. All right, no other questions, so we'll continue with the public meeting and our delegations, and the first delegation is Myron Steinman. Myron, are you here tonight? Okay. Peter Chauvin, Waterloo Region Home Builders Association. Welcome, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Pierre Chauvin.
It did say Peter right here, Pierre.
It sure did.
I can't, no excuses for my accent on your last name, so I'm sorry about it.
That's okay. I've been called worse. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I am a partner with MHBC Planning, but this evening I'm here on behalf of the Waterloo Home Builders Association. And there is a piece of correspondence I've left with you this evening. So thank you again for the opportunity. Our association has been the voice of residential development and construction and industry in the Waterloo region since 1946. We're a community of nearly 200 member companies that are a valuable contribution to the city building. Our industry invests in our economy, our infrastructure, and our community. Our member companies create over 90% of new housing stock that supports some 20,000 well-paying jobs and represents an annual investment of some $2.5 billion in the regional economy. Our association is committed to affordability, improving affordability and choice of new home purchasers. We do this by interacting positively with government, and particularly municipal government, to help craft legislation, regulation, and policies that affect the construction of new housing. Our association has been consulted. We've been involved in the stakeholder group to review and provide timely input in the background study, and we're certainly appreciative of this input. And we've been feel that we've been able to provide informed input and provide a unique lens on the details and costs of the projects that are identified in the background study document. In many instances, this infrastructure directly serves and must be coordinated with the new communities being developed. In some instances, it is designed and constructed concurrently with private sector developments. However, we feel we haven't been able to provide an appropriate level of input thus far, since we're not clear on the details of some of the infrastructure projects to be funded through the RDC. At this time, our association has neither seen some of the construction specifics that have been included, nor have we seen many of the specific project costs associated with the funding allocations. Ongoing consultation, review of the proposed project to be funded, and industry participation in other key decisions that inform the proposed new rate is crucial. For all intents and purposes, we are the most impacted stakeholder, as we directly represent those new residents and homeowners who will bear the burden of higher development charges through purchase of new homes. We understand the demands placed on municipal councils and the need for sustainably fund new growth-related services and infrastructure. However, without the timely release of appropriate materials, documents, and information, most notably individual project sheets that are typically a component of any background study, our association cannot ascertain that the calculation is either fair or reasonable at this time. Significant development charge increases primarily impact the new home buyer, and in particular young families with limited means who are looking to further their dreams of home ownership. It is those new homeowners that do not have an adequate voice in these kinds of decisions. Long-standing local businesses, their employees, and the community at large are also greatly affected by this increased development charge, since charges of this magnitude proposed go right to the bottom line of a new home. Development charges are assessed at the time of issuance of a building permit. When a new home is sold, the agreement of purchase and sale can be executed many months, sometimes over a year in advance of collection of the charge. If a substantial increase in development charge payable is imposed without adequate advance notice and sufficient transition period, home builders, including young families and those least able to afford it, will be impacted and potentially priced out of the market. Adverse economic effects anticipated, as well as issues of affordability, which is a major concern province-wide. It is therefore, we are suggesting or respectfully requesting this committee to take the following actions in relation to the new development charge bylaw. Number one, we direct staff to provide appropriate access to the materials and documents, detailed project sheets for each project and service. This will enable our industry to ensure that the appropriate infrastructure projects and level services are adequately planned. It will also allow our industry to ensure that figures derived in the new rate are appropriate and reflect the best and most up-to-date information related to the scope of the identified service. Secondly, direct staff to clarify how the proposed $865 million in various road projects accounts for a benefit to existing allocation. Based on our review, very little, roughly $10 million worth in total, is attributable to benefit to existing development, which does not seem to be appropriate in our view. This would seem to imply that there's almost no problems with existing infrastructure, road conditions, or capacity within the region. Thirdly, direct staff to adjust the transit ridership projections for new growth such that the proportion of future transit ridership in existing central areas where densities in existing transit facilities would be higher versus the future transit ridership in lower density areas are accurately balanced. It seems optimistic based on our review of the document that to assume that all new growth will have a transit mode share of over 50% higher than that of existing intensified communities. Fourth, direct staff to clarify the population forecasts. The background study appears to be based on a separate set of forecasts that the rest of the region's planning. Most development charges studies use a 2019 to 31 or 20 to 41 horizon for roads or water and sewer services, whereas the region's background study is based on a 2029 period. Fifth, direct staff to clarify and explicitly define a local service. We acknowledge that if a service or a service improvement is exclusively required or needed as a result of a particular development, then it should be a developer responsibility. However, improvements that are required for more than one development should not be considered a local service. Furthermore, a local service should not include service improvements required by existing development, background growth, or pre-existing conditions or deficiencies. Lastly, we respectfully request that we provide a six-month transition period for the new proposed development charge. Firstly, a delayed implementation will afford the opportunity to our association to effectively engage and provide input to the individual projects funded through the development charges. This phase in program will also allow delayed implementation for an appropriate transition between current development charge and proposed development charge such that prospective purchasers who have just entered into contracts for new homes are not unduly impacted. A development charge increase of this magnitude proposed cannot just be absorbed in the price of a new home without impact to price. This is particularly so on smaller housing products that are geared to young families and downsizing seniors. A 6-month deferral will go a long way to lessening this impact. The home industry can then use this time to find ways to help lessen the burden of this development charge increase in other ways. Our association remains open to discussing these concerns with staff, and we will remain engaged through the stakeholder group. It is our collective interest to ensure that the home ownership remains within reach for as many people as possible. Home ownership is a fundamental Canadian value that should be preserved. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chauvin. We do have a question, but before we just get to the question, I'd just like to say I think I heard at least 6 requests for information. And rather than responding to each of them in a public meeting, what we'll do is we'll compile your requests and the other requests for information from the other delegations, and we'll respond accordingly through staff with copies to all members of council. Councillor Foxton has a question.
Thank you. And through the chair, you asked for, well written, I did a very, very good job. A 6-month deferral will go a long way, but I don't know if we can do a 6-month deferral. And to Mr. Dyer, can we do a 6-month deferral?
It's a 6-month transition, I think he was asking.
Oh, okay, because it says actually deferral.
Yeah. Mr.
So
Dyer?
can there be a 6-month transition? Is
So
that possible?
if the question is, can the rates that are proposed come into effect 6 months after August 1st instead of on August 1st, then yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Just wanted clarification. Thank you.
Is that what the association is looking for?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Dyer?
If I may, if I could just continue with the response. The deferral then would basically reflect a reduction in the rate, and the reduction in that rate over that 6-month period would have to be funded, and it would have to be funded through property taxes and user rates.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, the next delegation is, all right, Barry.
Well, I
Councillor Ivanovic.
Thank you. Clarification from Mr. Dyer's response. You're saying it would have to be funded from taxes if we don't decrease the amount of projects that we're trying to recoup funds for through the DC. So the other option is we could decrease the overall amount by whatever that 6-month figure is, correct?
I would say it's easier said than done.
I think the point that I was making is that if council establishes a bylaw for development charges and then charges less than the rate that's calculated, then that's a revenue shortfall that has to be funded by some other means.
Okay, but but one of the options that council could look at is to simply reduce the overall amount of money that we're trying to recoup. We would have to know that before we actually pass the bylaw.
If your point is that council could, is your point that council could reduce the capital program?
Right.
So I suppose council could go through a process of amending the 2019 to 2028 capital program that was approved through the budget process back in February. I suppose if the level of spending, capital spending was reduced and it had the result then of having a lower development charge, then I suppose that's possible.
Yeah, I think we just need to be clear on what all of council's options are. And we'll have that debate at another point in time.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. Lynn Macaulay. Lynn here. Welcome, Lynn.
Mr. Chair, members of council, staff, and guests. Steve Garrison, who is the general manager of Cambridge Housing, and myself, who is the executive director of All In 2020, are here to present to you on behalf of the Cambridge Affordable Housing Roundtable. And our question really is, how will you be a housing hero? Hence the CAPE. As you know, the Cambridge Affordable Housing Roundtable is chaired by Cambridge Councillor Pam Wolf and has a diverse membership, including members from the Social Planning Council of Cambridge and North Dumfries, the United Way, Hug and All In, Housing Cambridge, City of Cambridge staff and council, regional staff and council, Canada Mortgage and Housing staff, the Cambridge Council on Aging, as well as community volunteers and members from other agencies. And as you know, affordable housing is a priority in this region. It was identified through the Wellbeing Waterloo region work, as well as the municipalities who are now undertaking strategic planning continually tell us that it's ranking high in their consultations. And as you know, the Cambridge Affordable Housing Roundtable has been leading discussions on municipal incentives, including development charges. And historically, this council has led the province in creating innovative ways to build affordable housing. And this council really understood much earlier than many other areas in the province how important affordable housing is to the community. However, now, with the leading of this council and others, many other municipalities have come on board, and the situation is now changing, and there are a lot of interesting new new incentives that are being used by many other communities in the province. So as you know, council has the ability to offset development charges. And I use the word offset because there is waiving and there is exemptions, and all of that has a huge impact on staff, but essentially ends up with the end goal that affordable housing projects don't need to pay development charges. But additionally, you can use development charges to generate new dollars to build affordable housing. And other municipalities in Ontario are doing this. And in order to do this, we need some information that is not yet ready at this point. So we aren't asking for that at this point, but to let you know that other municipalities are doing that. And at the next development charge review, several years from now, we will likely be coming to ask you to do that, because it is another way in which we can generate funds to create more affordable housing. And to talk about a specific example of how development charges can really assist in the creation of affordable housing, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Steve Garrison.
Thanks, Lynn. So Housing Cambridge provides 387 units of community housing on 8 sites around the city of Cambridge. We also have a development arm, Home Concept Property Management, and under that development arm, we've developed 2 projects. The second opened just this past year. It's a 30-unit development at 175, a 34-unit development at 175 Hespeler Road. It was built on the main transit corridor in Cambridge, and the focus on in that development was smaller units. It was mostly 1-bedroom apartments. Our next project is a 55-unit rental building on the old Satellite Motel site, and it's slated to begin construction within the next month. As a nonprofit developer, we have a number of challenges that we face. First of all, our equity is always limited. We face significant costs related to permits and development charges. Our cash flow prior to building permit, based on the programs we're funded under, is very challenging. The investment in affordable housing offers its first advance after the building permit, and then, of course, there are a lot of development expenses leading up to the building permit. Once we're up and running, property taxes increase at a greater rate often than rents each year. And given our commitment to affordable rents, and the fact that costs go up year by year, the overall viability of the project is always challenging. Against that background, regional development charge grants for affordable housing have created a very positive environment for groups like ours that are interested in developing that housing. The fact that they're ongoing and predictable is essential to encourage groups to enter this work. And actually, development charges And grants and/or exemptions can make the difference between a project that is viable and one that is not. To use our 175 Hespeler Road project as an example, regional development charges for that project were just over $335,000. The grant came at a time during the project that we were dealing with a real cash flow crunch, and it had the net effect of reducing the overall construction financing and takeout mortgage. So as we were projecting budgets, both capital and operating, with the Regional Development Charge Grant, we were projecting a $5,600 annual operating surplus. If you took that grant away, we were left with a $4,500 annual operating deficit. So as I said, sometimes development charge grants are the difference between a viable project and one that is not. I would argue that development charge grants are good investments for the region, particularly with when they're provided to nonprofit groups. With nonprofit housing providers, rents are maintained at affordable levels for the life of the building, not just for a 20 or 25-year affordability period. Nonprofits participate in regional eviction prevention programs, and we have mandates that go beyond maintaining the building and collecting the rents. We take seriously the need to develop strong and sustainable communities. If you look at 175 Hespeler Road, we have about 40 lower income tenants, and they typically, now that they're paying affordable rents, they have a few extra dollars. Those dollars are typically spent locally. And often they're working in low, minimum wage jobs and other kinds of works. They contribute to the local economy in many, many ways. We have two recommendations to bring before the committee today. The first is that development charge assistance continue to be made available for affordable housing that receives funding that's administered through the region, like the Investment in Affordable Housing Program. The second recommendation is that development charge assistance be expanded to include all affordable housing projects, such as those receiving funding directly from the Federal Co-Investment Fund through the National Housing Strategy. In conclusion, I would like to, on behalf of the Affordable Housing Committee in Cambridge, thank you for the opportunity to present, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve and Lynn. Very nice to hear from you. I can say there's no plans to discontinue the DC's exemptions for affordable housing, and the steering committee and staff will look at your second request. All right, thank you very much. Mark Kindrachuk. Welcome, Mark.
Hi. I wonder if Van can set up my presentation. Can you just lift your mic up a little bit? Sure. My name is Mark Kindrachuk. I'm the president of Intermarket Properties. We've been involved in the region for over 25 years. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our input into the development charges, as is an extremely important issue to us and other investors, developers, landowners in the region. First, I'll start with an executive summary, 3 points. The proposed industrial development charge increase, and I'll focus on industrial to focus the discussion, of 164% is really problematic. It will cost the region, frankly, jobs, taxes, and investment. It will decimate the marketplace. No easy way to say that, but anybody doing a 164% increase just doesn't work in this environment. Number two, the method to calculate the industrial DC needs to be consistent to what it has been in the past and going forward. Very important. The option one and option two, frankly, needs to be consistent to what's in the industrial DC today. Number three, we have a proposal of a 10% increase for development charges for years 1 to 3, and then, frankly, for years 4 and 5, going up to 20%. We're not asking for no development charges like DC exempt downtowns. We're not asking for a zero increase. We're asking for a reasonable increase because we know there's costs to be competitive. So that's the executive summary. Those are my 3 key points, and I'll go through detail through my presentation. As background, we started our process, and I'll detail that, on the east side lands of Cambridge 12 years ago. On the right-hand side of this slide is an article from 2013 when Jim Weidman, a regional councillor, said, we're behind on infrastructure, back in 2013. This year, in 2019, we're finally getting the infrastructure in. So we've been waiting 6 years, frankly, for when Jim, frankly, made this comment to the Waterloo Record for the east side lands. Industrial is a very important economic development driver for the region. A lot of focus has been on the downtown sexy office space for tech companies, and that's great. Industrial now, though, is advanced manufacturing. It's robotics. It's for automotive. The biggest employer in this region, private sector, is Toyota. They just announced $1.4 billion investment. You've got to support that investment by having supply chain nearby. Agritech, e-commerce, that's the future. So people's impression of industrial that may have been kind of dated, old, dirty, is not this industrial investment we're looking for in the region of Waterloo. So it's really important to support that. The property that we're dealing with up in East Side lands has been designated by the province as being significant for the entire province. And frankly, the increase of 164% will essentially decimate that opportunity. Here's a summary of just what our property, Challenger, FJF brands, who are in the East Side lands will be paying. DC increase that I contemplated will be a $91 million investment in infrastructure. And we've gone through the 301-page document of what's been tabled. So we have a good idea of what's been tabled. Have some questions about it, but we know what's been tabled. Taxes, $21 million a year annually. So when you look at the calculation of investment, when you have $20 million annually, it goes a long way for infrastructure as well. The other piece of the puzzle is the development that we're contemplating, plus Challenger, Hofstadter, and FJF brands, by the calculations in the DC report, create 6,800 jobs. That's got ripple effects, income tax, expenditures for the community. I've been around long enough to know when there's unemployment, there's a huge drag on the economy. So with people employed, a very big benefit. Here is the announcement, frankly, from a week and a half ago. The top talks about Toyota and the Lexus announcement. Great announcement. That was on a Monday. The same Monday, there was an announcement in an article in the Windsor Star saying, we can support the suppliers for the Toyota Woodstock plant from 200 kilometers away, even out to Windsor. So to compete in the supply chain marketplace for the advanced manufacturing investment, you've got to be competitive for not just in your local area, not against Markham and Vaughan, but against Southern Ontario. And those development charges aren't going up 156%. Here is a nice diagram that we're using. This shows Waterloo Region. It shows the 401, which is really the lifeblood of Southern Ontario. We've also shown the 5 biggest auto plants in Canada: Toyota, Woodstock, Toyota Cambridge, Ingersoll, Oakville, and frankly, the Honda in Alliston. You can see we're trying to position for the supply chain Cambridge and Waterloo Region in the center. If you look at the left table, those are the number of cars produced per year, and they're high margin cars. On the right-hand side, we've shown in blue the airports. We've shown Waterloo Region International Airport, we've shown Pearson, London, and Hamilton. Well, the people we're dealing with right now are frankly supply chain advanced manufacturing firms that do work for the auto industry and the aerospace industry. We're working with leads from Torrey Lamonti and others on trying to attract these people to the region. We've got a rare opportunity of having land, the Toyota investment, to compete really well with aerospace supply chain and advanced manufacturing and the automotive sector. So we've been working at this for 12 years. Great work by Rod Regier, Matthew Chandy, and others. But by raising the development charges, what you're proposing will kill that. The time is always an important factor. Right now, we're at the late cycle on the economics. There's been a 10-year growth pattern, and people are always saying we're in the 9th inning. Here's a segment of what gets shown to all the institutional investors. 2019 is at the back end of the economic cycle. At this point in time, if you raise development charges, what you're contemplating, no one's going to make an investment. And I understand that because there's been 10 years of growth and a recession is going to happen. It will happen. And frankly, we just don't want to be at the back end of that. So it's absolutely the wrong time to make Waterloo Region uncompetitive. Here is what I think is a more realistic graph about how the communities stack up. What I've shown is your option 1, which is an Appendix I, showing the 164%, probably the highest in the whole province. Option 2, frankly, is the same analysis just by using a different calculation. What we're promoting is a more reasonable competitive band of 10% increase for years 1 to 3, 20% from years 4 and 5. The key thing, competitive. Not zero, not no increase, an increase to be competitive. Here's the slide we think is very realistic. So again, I've showed the auto sector and the supply chain. We're trying to position ourselves to be in the middle of the node. On the right-hand side, here's who we really compete against for industrial, Woodstock. We compete against Brantford. We compete against Guelph. I deal with suppliers that have existing facilities in Guelph. They can either expand there or try and get them to come to Cambridge. If we're much higher in DCs, they're not going to come. Look at Woodstock, it's at 0. So those are the competitive pieces you got to look at. We're not competing against Markham for industry. We're not competing against Vaughan. We're competing against those 3 cities. And you can clearly see where they are at. They just passed those bylaws within the last 6 months. So next 5 years, we're competing against that. So the proposal that we've put in the bottom just puts us slightly above, frankly, where we need to be and competes against Guelph, Woodstock, and Brantford. And if we can't, no one's going to come here. So when we look at something, we need to be competitive. And we positioned ourselves, and with the new announcement, if we don't do this in a logical and competitive manner, you won't get any new investment. So in summary, we believe a consistent non-residential versus industrial calculation with a realistic increase for years 1 to 3 and 4 to 5. And again, not DC exempt, not a 0 increase, a reasonable increase to be competitive. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate that. And I think it's fair to say that based on our past track record as a council, you know, the current industrial development charges bylaw has a rate that's discounted by 50%. So we're committed to doing what we can to grow our industrial base. And I'd just like to remind you that the purpose of the study is to show the maximum permissible rate that we could charge. So you referred to it as a proposed rate. I know it might be slicing it a little bit, but that is not what we're proposing. That's what the background study says we could charge to a maximum. And in the past, we've usually discounted that rate. So you're fully aware of that, right, Mark?
I am. The challenge is, and I think some other speakers will talk about it, this proposal came out about a week and a half ago. It killed one of our investment deals. So one of the major investment pension funds in this country got wind of 164% and go, this is so unrealistic, I'm not even going to look at it. So we put that in context when it comes out and it scares off investment.
That's unfortunate. But my point is that we're not proposing to raise the DCs by 164%. The report shows, as per the Act, what the maximum permissible rate is that we can charge.
Sure, okay.
Okay. Councillor Jowett?
Sorry, through the chair, I was going to allude to the same thing, but I also think we should take into consideration that Woodstock and Brantford and some of the historical lessons learned when we've gone so low, and not to suggest that we shouldn't be in line with what we've done in the past, but when municipalities have gone so low and had to make up that debt load or slow their capital projects later, which have cost them in the end, and then their taxes have gone up exponentially and more aggressively. But I know we're
So thanks very much, Mark. Message received. We really appreciate that, and we're fully aware of that. Thank you very much. So I'm thinking maybe one more delegation, and then we're going to have to suspend the meeting for special council meeting. Thanks for your indulgence. Paul DeMelo from Kagan Shastri. Paul DeMelo. All right. Dan Einwechter. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening to us. I'm going to make this quick. You're going to meet your 7 o'clock deadline.
I knew I could count on you, Dan.
Mark's smarter than I am. I agree with everything he says, and more. What I would say to you is the following, that I'm old enough to remember that years ago, England thought that they could raise their tax rates dramatically enough it was going to solve all their problems, and it did not, and they had to reverse their actions. So, we're in between 0 and 80%, right? Where's the answer for this or any other action you take? I would tell you that my clients are extremely transient, and they'll go where it makes the best economic sense for them to be located. And it would be unfortunate if they would choose to go to other communities, so my trucks are only going to and from, are traveling through Cambridge and not going to Cambridge to pick up or deliver freight on behalf of our clients and not having employment locally. Although we service North America, I'm very proud of what we do here locally. That's on the operating side, and then I am also a significant landowner with 100-plus acres in the city of Cambridge that I think are great employment lands. At the right price and the right rate, we can attract the right people, but it's going to be key that we make the right decisions. We make them ourselves and with the help of our local governments to make the right decisions to attract the right people. So we're here to support you. I'm not a zero tax guy. I believe in paying taxes. I believe in fairness. And that's all we ask for is fairness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Einwechter. And that's what we try to achieve as council members as well, as fair as we possibly can be, and recognizing there's lots of competing interests in our community. So thanks for that. So at this point, I'm going to suggest, or not suggest, but we are going to suspend the public meeting for a special council meeting, and then we'll reconvene after the special council meeting. Chair Redmond. Members to take their seats, please. Okay, I'd like to reconvene the public meeting, please. Going to reconvene the public meeting, please. I know that's a very tough act to follow, but we must continue with the public meeting. We have important matters still to discuss with respect to development charges in the review. So thanks very much again to the attendees here for the public meeting for your indulgence as we made that very important and significant announcement. Thank you. So continuing with our list, the next person I had was Mr. Clements, Dan Clements. Welcome, Dan.
Good evening, councilors. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Dan Clements. I'm representing Citizens for Cambridge. Citizens for Cambridge is a volunteer-based organization dedicated to harnessing the passion, ingenuity, and commitment of Cambridge citizens to support the development of a better community for all. When I first heard about the idea of the LRT coming to our region, I was a skeptic. The skepticism continued until I visited one of the first LRT public information sessions that was held in Cambridge. As I walked around the room trying to absorb the future vision laid out, my attitude quickly changed. I left that meeting with an understanding that the LRT was about much more than transportation. It was a tool to transform our cities and stimulate development around a central spine. The potential development benefits, particularly for our core areas, became paramount in my newfound support for the LRT. This future vision appears to be coming true in spades for Kitchener and Waterloo. Cambridge really needs the LRT so we can also experience some of these key benefits. For your current decisions, it's great that Kitchener and Waterloo may no longer need development charge exemptions for core areas. We sincerely wish that Cambridge was in that position as well. It's our understanding that the City of Cambridge is seeking a continuation of regional exemptions for the Cambridge core, and we endorse their position completely. In a spirit of fairness, we ask that for your support on this, at least until we get ION Phase 2.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Glenn Scheels. Glenn? Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of committee. I have a presentation to go through. I'm here tonight to speak primarily to the brownfield component of the RDC and how it's tied in. And I'm here to make some general comments on behalf of our firm in the industry, but also to speak to you about a couple of specific projects that are underway right now from Reed's Heritage Homes and Auburn Developments. And both of these firms have new ongoing projects that could be adversely impacted should the changes that have been contemplated in the March report go forward. I've also been working closely with Mr. Craig Robson. Craig will be following up in a little while and making some additional comments, and I certainly endorse what he's going to put forward to you. Certainly the brownfield programs and the components that are tied into the RDC are important components in realizing our urbanization goals here in the region and its constituent municipalities. We've had a manufacturing history in our communities, and that has caused sites to be contaminated to one degree or another. And an important consideration, of course, is having those sites cleaned up, and we've got a program now up and running that has been successful in realizing those objectives. There's certainly other areas that will be redeveloped in the future that have had a manufacturing or commercial history. Many of those are along the Ion route, and there will be certainly a need for further remediation before sites are put to new productive uses. I also want to highlight that there's certainly a long lead time in that whole program of purchasing sites, understanding what's there, remediating them, demolition of buildings that are there, filing and obtaining RSCs, going through a planning process, and ultimately building permits. So that whole process takes an awful lot of time, and the programs that the region has and the RDC components of it need to reflect those timeframes. Currently, a couple of the projects that I'll highlight in a minute are in the process of cleaning up sites and trying to obtain an RSC, but they certainly won't be ready and available to obtain the program applicability by the time that the new bylaw comes in. Reed's Heritage Homes, our firm I'm sure most of you are familiar with. They've been active in our community for an awful long time. They've used the brownfield programs for these two Cambridge sites. The one on the left is in Preston, Margaret Street. The one on the right is Munch Avenue, just south of Canamera Parkway off Hespler, also in Cambridge. And those two sites totaled 25 acres. They've been cleaned up. The Munch site is just getting into the residential building end of the project right now. And in total, there was $6 million worth of cleanup cost expended there, 380 units constructed. And these programs were very instrumental in realizing that success. Currently, Reeds are developing the ODC site in Waterloo, very close to the hospital and to the Ion station in that area. This is at the corner of Moore and Roger. It was a former industrial site. It was purchased in 2019 after a long property acquisition process. The demolition of the buildings and cleanup of the site are certainly underway right now. But all through that process leading up to where we are today, the RDC programs were always contemplated. They were part of that due diligence process and that purchase process. And they are a necessary component of making this a successful project. And you can see the sketch at the bottom. We're going to have a 5-acre site redeveloped with 2 mid-rise buildings and a series of stacked townhouses, along with public park components. So it's a very good project that fits really well within that neighborhood. But again, these programs are critical to it realizing its success. In terms of Auburn developments, again, they've been active in our region for quite some time. The Barrel Yards project was a huge project, and it's still indeed under construction. And the Arrow Lofts in downtown Kitchener is now in its second phase as well. Both of those projects had the benefit of the RDC programs and the TIG programs as well. And now Auburn has moved on to another really large project, the redevelopment of the Schneider's property in Kitchener. That site was acquired by Auburn in 2017. Demolition began in May of 2018. That's when the demolition permit was acquired. And that's really when the time frame starts for the redevelopment allowance. So remediation is underway, an RSC is going to follow that, and planning applications are underway for that site. And it's really going to be a significant and transformational project. We're going to have about 2,800 new residential units. We're going to repurpose some of the existing buildings that are on the site near Borden and Cortland and create an opportunity for new jobs. There'll be public spaces and amenities there. But, you know, to get there is certainly a challenge. It's a big site. There has been significant demolition take place, and there was about 740,000 square feet of former industrial space that came down on that site, and that's the equivalent of about 660 units using the conversion factor that the region has for the development charge allowance. The demolition cost certainly is high. It's over $2 million, and the site remediation, including the soft costs, is going to be in the order of $15 million. Now, if we can capture all of that demolition and that demolition credit for 660 units worth of development charge and offset that against the site remediation costs, that will certainly go a long way to assisting. There'll be a number of buildings, but our stage one will likely be 3 mid-rise buildings along Cortland. And I raise the time component because, again, right now, the redevelopment allowance has a 7-year time frame. And we've been discussing with staff and suggesting that on sites of this magnitude, that just is a little tight. So we started in May of 2018, and if everything goes smoothly, you know, we should be able to get building permits before our 7 years is up. But again, the challenge will be to utilize all 660 units worth of credit. But if we run into difficulties with the site cleanup or with our risk assessment or ministry approval, you know, that's going to back us out perhaps to that 6-7 years, and it's going to be very difficult to realize that and take advantage of that. So we've been discussing with staff the suggestion to extend that period for those redevelopment credits. So in summary, you know, I think the programs that we have, and especially as they relate to the development charge programs, are really important programs and necessary programs with a lot of long-term city building benefits. And those benefits, I think, were highlighted as well in the staff report from last March. We're remediating contaminated sites, and as you could see from those examples, actually, of all those REEDS projects, those sites were surrounded by residential development. So, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us to facilitate that improvement if we can. We're building new units, residential units. We're building new office space on these contaminated sites, and a lot of them are in central areas where there is good infrastructure and where they're well served by transit. So that's an important benefit as well. And of course, by doing that, we're creating new opportunities for jobs, new opportunities for people to live in, and creating new assessment as well, which of course brings long-term benefits. So the two projects I highlighted, the ODC and the Schneiders, are projects that are in process. They're relying on the programs. We can't apply, you know, under the current rules and get in there by July, if you will, because we just won't have risk, or I should say, our RSCs in place. So if these programs end abruptly in July, that's going to have a significant consequence on these projects. So we'd like to avoid that. We'd like to suggest that the RDC demolition credit or allowance be extended beyond the 7 years so that sites like the Schneiders site can take advantage of that. We'd like to see the RDC exemption program continue for at least another RDC cycle, but perhaps longer. Because again, as I mentioned, there are more sites that are out there that will be coming up for redevelopment. And as well, if you do decide to phase it out, then we've made some suggestions and talked to staff about some improvements to the TIG program. So those are my comments, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Okay.
That you have.
Thank you very much, Glenn. We do have a couple questions. Councilor Urbanovic, then Harris, then Shantz.
Thanks, Mr. Scheels, for coming in this evening and sharing some of your thoughts with us. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit with respect to both the two projects that are still on the pending list, as well as those that have occurred in the past. If you've had an opportunity to speak with any of those who were involved in their development, I'm just wondering if the program as it exists today was not in place, or maybe more specifically, if the program as it's being proposed was in place at the time, is it likely that those projects would have proceeded at the time that they did? And what is the potential impact on these projects if we see the program not continuing in its present form?
Well, certainly on these two projects, that are underway, as I mentioned, there'd certainly be significant impacts. How, the developer would try to mitigate those, I'm not sure. We're banking on them continuing. But as I indicated, there's a long process to go through any development. And these sites, even though they're in cleanup and demolition remediation now, decisions were made to purchase these sites several years ago. And, they were banking on and counting on those programs continuing because they were important line items in the whole pro forma process. I have, discussed these programs, obviously, with clients of ours and others in the industry, and they're important pieces to that whole decision-making process. I've talked to the realtors about it. One of our clients was recounting to us how bankers approach these things and how important it is on the financing side as well. So they're important, all through that whole development industry, if you will. And again, I think we've seen, some pretty good results and a lot of really good projects that have been made possible, by that component as well. Not the only component, obviously, to the project's success, but it's certainly been an important component to a lot of projects in our community.
But I guess to be a little more direct, is it possible that, in fact, some of these projects may not have proceeded in as timely of a manner as they did if the program wasn't in place, and hence the revenue streams that we've started to see, and I guess the clock ticking towards those revenue streams may not have been realized, and we would continue to be sitting with empty lots in some cases?
Yeah, the short answer is yes.
And the second, or I guess the third question I have is, as we go forward and look at this issue, do you have a sense of what kind of taxes, for example, the Schneider's development might generate in the future? Have you done any estimation on that?
I haven't, no, but given, the number of units that are there and the amount of commercial space, it's going to be a big number.
Okay, and because I think that's important for us to consider, if that property sits empty for even 5 more years until the numbers make sense.
Certainly, I can get that calculated and provide that.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Urbanovic. Councilor Harris.
Thank you. Good evening, Glenn, and thanks for your presentation. I would probably concur that the bulk of the public, the majority of the public, frankly, doesn't perhaps appreciate the extent of what, the remediation of a brownfield site all entails and the cost that it entails. You did provide some examples, and I know driving around the city, we know there's many still around. I'm wondering if you can just explain outside of the example of, a new redevelopment and residential living and other economic drivers, why regional councils should care and the general public should care, frankly, on, remediating these sites.
Well, as I indicated, there's benefits on the environment side, not to have these sites with contaminants on them. But, if we look at the urban form that we're trying to create, and going back to a comment that, your colleague, Councillor Galloway mentioned earlier, about back to the early days of the region's growth management strategy and the whole notion of trying to create a more compact urban form, the kind that's being promoted, obviously, by all the various provincial policies out there. A lot of the lands that have been cleaned up, not all of them, but a lot of them have been the central part of our city. And that's where we are able to realize some good densities. That's where we've got our best transportation assets and where we've made a significant investment in the new rapid transit line. So having all those pieces fit together and making, the land use and transportation connection obviously is pretty important. So I think there's a lot of really good, city building or community building benefits to the program.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Harris. Councillor Schatz.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I understand you're counting on dollars that you expected to be there for the development. And I understand the importance of our support in that. You said, I think the total cost for the cleanup of, I think I pulled the Schneider's property is approximately, it's running up to $20 million to clean it up and get it ready to kind of have a clean site and a development. Can you help me put in perspective what the increase in value of that is? And I understand it's a value to the city as well, because you're going to get taxes and everything else. But help me put those two pieces together. I haven't got the tax calculations as Councillor Verbanovic mentioned, and I think that's a really important one. Obviously, the value of the property is going to go up. We're going to be able to generate some significant tax revenues from that site and from that redevelopment. But there's also other public assets, if you will, that have come along as well. There will be new streets, there'll be new trails, and plugging into the trail system of the area. There'll be new public parks and private parks in there as well. So it's a big site, so we're developing a really complete neighborhood there with all kinds of facilities. So there's a lot of benefits there, and it's a catalyst project really for that whole area. And, there's certainly some risks associated with it because it's a pioneering project as well. So all of these programs really help to facilitate that. There's an increased value to the developer too out of all of that. Can you put those two pieces together? In terms of there's certainly an increase to the developer in property value. There's there'll be buildings there that the developer will own. So, for sure there's value to be added. But again, there's public benefits and as well as private benefits for sure on these things. Yep.
Okay, I see no further speakers. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Mr. Scheels. Thanks for coming in. Mitchell Blaine. Mr. Blaine? Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Mitchell Blaine. I'm a Senior Vice President with CBRE in town, and I'm here today with a number of my colleagues from other major commercial real estate brokerages, including Whitney Real Estate, Colliers International, Avis & Young, Coldwell Banker Commercial, and Cushman & Wakefield. And on behalf of the major commercial real estate brokerages in the region, we wanted to take this opportunity to express our sincere concern over the proposed changes to the RDC bylaw and background study recommendations. Increasing the non-residential development charge by approximately 164% would be devastating to the industrial, office, and commercial retail development industry. We believe new growth is paramount in expanding tax base, assessment, and jobs. And our concern with the proposed increase in the RDC is that we'll see an immediate stop to new developments and projects in the region. As advocates for the continued growth of the region, we assist both investors and end users including manufacturers, technology companies, and service companies, to identify and evaluate the benefits of locating and growing in the region, as compared to other markets in Canada and abroad. As such, we have a significant concern about the changes to the DC bylaw, and the impact these changes may have on the region's ability to compete with nearby municipalities, as was said by Mr. Kindrachuk, but also on a global scale. Our group's primary focus is the impact of the DC changes to the employment sector of development and ensuring the region remains competitive to attract and retain companies. As such, the changes to this DC bylaw, specifically to the non-residential development charge, is where our primary concern lies. Our group remains strong advocates of the high-quality infrastructure investments in the region in order to create a place where people and companies can grow, but we'd suggest the approach to recover these investments be handled in a very sensitive and delicate manner as not to spook the market, including both the end users and investors. I'd like to highlight two primary concerns and propose solutions and concepts to help address them. First is the idea to keep the current non-residential development charge classification of non-industrial versus industrial. The development charge background study includes 4 options, including a single non-residential development charge for all asset classes, including office, industrial, manufacturing, and retail. However, we believe the current non-residential development charge classification should remain as defined in the existing development charge bylaw as non-industrial versus industrial. In light of the many cost pressures, including trade disputes, inventory and material cost inflation, and labor inflation, the employment-generating industries, including industrial, manufacturing, and office, may be the most sensitive to paying these additional costs related to the development and expansion of facilities. Whether it's an end user building or expanding an owned property or leasing from an investor, adding significant costs may significantly impact the end user's decision to locate in this region. The premise remains that in the end, the tenant, the buyer, and the user will ultimately bear the burden of these extra costs and will not be willing to take on the added costs when alternative markets or options exist nearby. The proposed single non-residential development charge would make the region's industrial development charge the second highest in Southern Ontario when you accumulate the non-residential DC, including the region, the city, and education components. It's our recommendation that the existing asset class-specific approach to non-residential development charges remain and not put the region at a significant disadvantage in competing for employment generators and jobs to acquire and grow facilities in the region. In particular, industrial, manufacturing, and office development charges need to remain competitive with other markets in Southern Ontario, as been mentioned before, who have actually reduced their industrial development charges, including Halton Hills and Burlington, in order to attract more investment and industry-based jobs. The second theme I'd like to highlight is the timing of when the development charge bylaw changes could come into effect. The background study and draft RDC contemplate the changes to the non-residential development charge coming into effect in the summer. This would be a very rapid change and have dramatic impact to the cost-based structures for both end users and investors' business plans and ultimately project feasibility. Like interest rates and recent changes to minimum wage in Ontario, our group would suggest a phase and monitor approach whereby policymakers can monitor the gradual changes of any possible negative impacts as a result of the changes to the regional development charges. This phase and monitor approach will allow the region to modify the increase plan if there's significant negative impacts to the as a result of the policy. Again, we understand the importance of many of these recent and upcoming infrastructure projects, in particular the one that was just announced earlier tonight. However, we feel a gradual approach in increasing the costs over time is the most responsible approach that can also enable the region stakeholders to monitor any possible negative and unpredicted fallout that an immediate and substantial change could have on non-residential development and investment in our region. It'd be our recommendation that regional development charges increase consistent with the increases being proposed by the individual cities, in particular the City of Cambridge. We'd propose a 10% increase on years 1 to 3 and a 20% increase for years 4 to 5 for both city and regional development charges. This level of phased increase will ensure the region remains competitive with neighboring communities in Southern Ontario. And added to that, a phased approach may actually act as a stimulus to entice both end users and investors to deploy capital more quickly as to avoid added costs later on. Should those investments be delayed or deferred, the increased amount at the future date will still not be prohibitive and will still remain competitive. In closing, our group and its members are not only actively involved with businesses in the region, but most of us call the region of Waterloo home and deeply care to see the region remain competitive and grow to its fullest potential. We appreciate the need for critical investments in infrastructure, but want to ensure we remain competitive both locally and abroad as to attract and grow high-quality companies in the region. As the ION public transit system is about to commence, we need to remember that broadening the employee base will increase ridership and ensure the ION investment is a success. Attracting and retaining quality businesses will not only ensure prosperity for the community and the people that live in the region, but by adding jobs and spurring developments of new buildings, tax base will grow and we'll have even stronger abilities to repay these important investments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Blaine. Really appreciate that. I'd just like to reiterate what I shared with Mr. Kindrachuk earlier.
Of course.
We're not proposing to raise industrial DCs by 164%.
Of course.
Okay.
Great news.
All right, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Harris, there may be a question, Mr. Blaine, just
Yeah,
one
hey,
second.
Mitch, if you don't mind coming back, I know some of us are all keen to get out. However, Mitch, tell me in other jurisdictions, since you've probably got a good idea of what happens in Southwest Ontario, in the past, communities that have decided to perhaps increase more than perhaps the expected threshold, the scenarios as to which may have happened. I think, and you and I had discussed this scenario in Milton, for instance, what happened to the development in that particular community at a certain time. And I don't know if you want to talk about a few quick examples of jurisdictions that may have had good or bad experiences.
And let's back up to what's playing out in the marketplace where capital, whether it's a manufacturer or an investor, are looking for opportunistic and emerging markets, okay? Outside of the major cities, which are becoming very expensive. I'll answer your question in a second. And they're looking at regions as they did Milton, which looks quite different now than it did back in 2010 when they moved the development charge from $9 to approximately $19 very quickly. And there was, if you look at stats, a rapid slowdown in projects delivering. It took from more of the investment community, because most of the lands in Milton were controlled by large pension funds. There was realistically a 4 years hiatus and no-fly zone in Milton as a result of this added $10 cost to project feasibility. So we have seen it in the past. I would challenge, I'm going a bit off script, which I should never do, but it's also about communication. And to my point about not knowing that this was not necessarily proposed, but the maximum amount allowed, shows me that it was not properly communicated to the community. Milton, as an example, had they signaled to the market that it was coming over a period of time, to me is where this issue has really come up, provided we can find a reasonable solution somewhere in the middle ground. So we've seen it before, Councillor Harris. I would be very concerned about even the collateral damage that's been done from investors. I see a number of faces here that are both from the manufacturing sector as well as the development community that are very concerned that this actually might come to fruition. Now it's damage control time. So we've seen it before and it has had an impact.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Harris. Thanks very much, Mr. Blaine. And,
thank you.
And we too recognize how important communication is on this matter, so thanks for that. Mr. Robson. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair Strickland. I can, if I don't use up my 10 minutes doing it, I can answer the question about ODC. I was involved in that right from the beginning. I never put the question to them, would you have done the deal? So I'm speaking from observation. but the numbers were real tight. It took a long time to negotiate that transaction. The purchase price is significant, and it was a very spirited and difficult time of coming up with a final deal. In my view, if they had known that there would not be an RDC exemption, I don't want to say there wouldn't be one, because I'm not the guy making the decisions at that company. They're brighter than that. But I think it would have been very, very much likely that it wouldn't have gone forward. And that's an observation from someone that was there for the full time period. So our firm acts for Reed's Heritage, as you know, on the ODC site. They have another site which is also at risk, and that's the Munch Avenue site, the one that's just starting to pull building permits. They are also counting on the RDC exemption, which I'll call just the exemption, because all these terms, I get them backwards if they have too many words. And they've just started to pull permits. And we do not know whether or not that is going to continue based on what we have read in the staff report and our inability to get an answer as to whether or not complete applications for the exemption will continue to get that exemption after the new bylaw comes in, if the staff report was adopted. So not only is the ODC site at risk, I've told our client that I think, because I can't get an answer, that the Munch site is also at risk, and that hopefully was not the intention of the staff report. But the staff report said that pending and incomplete applications may be affected. So I assumed that that meant complete ones wouldn't be. And the Friday afternoon that I got the staff report to show up the following Tuesday, I sent an email saying, are complete sites exempt from the new policy if it comes in? I still don't know. So that's something which is very important, because there are ongoing projects pulling permits that are counting on the exemption that they thought they already had, and we in the industry do not know if that's going to continue. That's just an aside. That's not even in my script, and I shouldn't go off script either. This all started from our perspective when the Frame Bud site lost its redevelopment allowance in last fall. Their demolition happened 7 years and 6 months ago, and they knocked down 1 million square feet, and their redevelopment allowance is gone because of the 7-year limitation. That's what got our attention, that there's something going on that needs to be dealt with. The Frame Bud site is about, I think, in the 70 acres range. It has taken forever to clean up. They've just got their last RSC. We have a report from MTE that's this thick about all the testing and stuff they had to do to get that site to market. And they're probably going to register their plan of subdivision in the next 2 or 3 months. The first permit might get pulled early next year, because it takes time to get permits. Even if they got 10 years, which is the latest thing that's, I don't want to call it a proposal, the statement in the background study, they'll never come close to having building permits on that whole site in the next 2 or 3 years. It'll take them 20 years probably from the time they started the demolition until they get their final permit, because a redevelopment allowance on a site like that is allocated proportionately across the whole site. So you don't get it all until you get your final permit pulled. And that means your final building is on the whole site is being built. So these time frames, they sound, how could it take so long? Anybody that's never done development work asks that question, and those of us who've done it for a long time just realize it does. And when you're dealing with large contaminated sites, all the numbers are just, they're as expensive as all get out, and it takes way longer than it should be. And that wasn't even what I was going to say. I'd like to talk about the interrelationships of the tax increment grant program, the redevelopment allowance, and the exemption. The TIG, is what we call the tax increment grant, repays remediation costs from increased costs that are generated solely from the cleaned up site, which taxes would not otherwise have been available but for the cleanup. That's a long-standing program. It works well. It has some serious financial limitations that make it worth about 50 cents on the dollar that I don't have time to deal with in my remaining 9.5 minutes. There's the exemption.
You have 5 minutes.
I'll trade you. There's the exemption, which says when your remediation costs, you don't have to pay any development charges to the region until you've essentially used up your remediation costs. And there's the redevelopment allowance, which isn't a brownfields program, but it's very definitely related to the brownfields program. The redevelopment allowance has been explained as your credit for essentially putting back up stuff that you knocked down so you didn't cause any growth until you exceed what was there before. The redevelopment allowance on sites for the current bylaw is 7-year expiry. The document says potentially 10. I've noted I think that's way too short. What concerns us, and I'll come back to the redevelopment allowance. In March of this year, regional staff recommended that a fast phase out of the exemption, a limit of $1 million per site. And if you notice Glenn's little graph up there, their soft cost was $793,000 for that site alone. So that doesn't leave a whole lot to clean up. That's just the application fees and the engineers and all the stuff they have to do. And also eliminated soft costs. The effect of that was essentially to eliminate the exemption immediately. They say there's a transition, but with the caps and the time it takes to do these things, with $1 million cap that's going to get even smaller likely, that's essentially an immediate elimination for any large project. And I'm proposing that proposed transition was simply unfair. It doesn't give people time to react to a program that's been around since 2006 and just have it disappear overnight. There's an issue with the difference between exemptions and redevelopment allowance that I didn't realize until it was explained to me slowly in a large font by your very capable Mr. Hill, who's used to be with doing the brownfield stuff. He was wonderful. The current people are wonderful too, but he sort of explained it to me slowly. When you give an exemption, as I understand it, you essentially have to cut a check for the amount of the exemption because you're not allowed to spread the exempted amount around the rest of the community and raise their DCs. So the money's got to come from somewhere, so essentially you got to cut a check. And I think that may have a lot to do with why exemptions are unattractive to regional staff, is it's costing them money and money is acknowledged tight. Redevelopment allowance doesn't require you to do that. Redevelopment allowance, demolition credits, are simply recognizing you didn't cause any growth until you create more square footage than you knock down, so it doesn't force you to backfill and cut the checks. It doesn't require that payment, which I think is a dramatic difference from the exemption. The other thing that Mr. Hill taught me is that, if you have redevelopment allowance demolition credits that are available to a site such as Frame Bud, which would be 1 million square feet times potentially $16, you have to take that redevelopment allowance first if you're doing development. You can't say, no, I'd rather take the brownfield exemption. You've got to use up the redevelopment allowance. And so on a site like Frame Bud, where they may not even put back up 1 million square feet because it's a different type of development now subdivided into 10 or 15 lots or blocks, they may never ever come to get the exemption if they had a redevelopment allowance that had a really healthy time period, because they have to take it first, which would keep them away from the exemption, so you wouldn't have to be cutting the checks for the exemption amounts because of a Frame Bud site. Very similar with the Schneider site with 750,000 square feet or whatever it was. There's a lot of redevelopment allowance there that has to get chewed up before they can even come close to touching an exemption. And certainly, I don't think either one of those sites are going to have any exemption payable in the next 5 years because there's so much redevelopment allowance, if the redevelopment allowance was available. And right now, Frame Bud has nothing, and they need it back. There's been a suggestion that the combination of the TIG and the exemption somehow allow double dipping. I have to acknowledge, when I explained the TIG and the exemption to our client, their eyes lit up for about the 8 seconds it took me to say, no, there's no double dipping. If you get a credit, if you get money under the exemption, it comes off of the TIG. You get money on the TIG, it comes off the exemption. There is no way that I can see possible how you can get paid twice for the same money under the way the programs are quite properly set up. The City of Kitchener proposed development charges bylaw reflects the concerns that we've been expressing. What they do is they give a 5-year eligibility for former residential sites and 10 years for non-residential sites, which sounds pretty close to the statement that's in the background study for the region. There's a major difference. The City of Kitchener says if the site is contaminated, the chief building official has the authority to extend the period by another 10 years. So a former non-res site can get 20 years, and a former res site can get 15. We would like the region to essentially give a 20-year period across the board, or at least give it to large contaminated sites. And if you can't see fit to do that, adopting the Kitchener Protocol would work if we had assurances that that 10 years was presumptively given. We don't want to, we would assume that if you have a legitimate site that's dirty and taking time to be finished, we would get the additional 10 years. But one way or another, a site like Frame Bud needs 20 years because it's going to take them a decade probably to sell out, especially if you have some economics uncertainties.
Mr. Robson, you're a couple minutes over, so just in fairness to delegations, if you could wrap up, please.
Okay. I will suggest the recommendation that we're going to do. If you are going to eliminate or tamper with the exemption, I repeat Glenn's comments, at least let it stay in for the next bylaw period to allow for a fair transition. Have a very healthy redevelopment allowance period that keeps the money concentrating on the redevelopment allowance as opposed to the exemption, which will reduce the financial impact on the region, and then develop a TIG program in that period that's got a cost of money factor into it so that there's a good program at the end that doesn't require any money from the region. It's coming out of taxes that are generated from the site to make up if we lose the exemption. That's a kind of a transition that might work.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have a question, Councillor Harris.
Thanks, Craig, for your presentation. I drive by the Bud Frame site every morning, and I know that although 3,000 plus employees will never work on that site ever again, I'm hopeful that it's redeveloped in the near future. So you, in your report, mentioned recommendations to make that tax increment grant a better incentive. Just wonder if you can quickly elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'll try to do it. I'll tell you what the problem is. It is a good program, don't get me wrong. I mean, we appreciate it. We appreciate anything. But the trouble is the timing. You do your demolition at the beginning of the project, that's when you spend your big bucks. And that takes a couple of years sometimes, or in our case, in Frame Bud, 7 because of the huge contamination factor. You then have to get your site developed and built out, which takes time. You then have to get MPAC to assess the taxes, which takes just time. We'll just say it takes a lot of time. You then have to have one full fiscal calendar year of taxes because the program quite rightly pays this grant from collected taxes, not somewhere else. That, in Frame Bud's case, that could be 12 years from the time you started to spend your money, and there's no interest factor on it. So if you take the money spent at the beginning of the project, and then it's spread out over potentially 10 years of payments, like you don't get it all in the first year, it's increments and it's paid over time. So it might be worth 40, 50 cents on the dollar present value. If there was a cost of money factor in there, a fair one, prime plus 1 or whatever, so it's just something that sort of reflected a fair cost of money, then I think the people that are in the industry would be able to say, okay, I'm not getting all my money back right away, but I'm getting a return on the money over time. And most of the people that are doing this are not penniless, but their accountants are about as careful as the region's accounting people. And if the numbers don't work, they say, you're not doing the project. So they don't jump into projects without having very careful analysis of the numbers done. And the TIG, although very much appreciated, is not viewed as being a huge incentive. It's sort of, I was told by someone who's been doing this a long time, what that does is helps us, because we know there's going to be unexpected costs, we know there's going to be unexpected time, we know our budgets are not going to be met just from historical experience. It gives us a bit of a buffer, takes the edge off. Very good, but it's not enough, especially if we get rid of the exemption. If we're going to get rid of the exemption, put a good cost of money factor in there, and I think the industry, if you give us 5 years to transition, would be able to say, okay, that's potentially a fair change of horses.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Robson, and to you and Mr. Scheels, thanks so much for your thoughtful comments on the review of our Brownfield Incentives Program. As you know, you were at our committee meeting a few weeks ago. The report was tabled, and we took no action on that pending further review. So we are looking at it, and your input here tonight is being thoughtfully considered, so we do appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Brian Blackmere. Mr. Blackmere?
Thank you very much, Chairman Strickland.
Welcome.
Members of the committee. My name is Brian Blackmere. I'm a planner, project manager with Pearle Hospitality. We are the owner or operator of the Cambridge Mill Restaurant in lovely downtown Galt. I'm here to talk a little bit about our project, which is immediately adjacent to the Cambridge Mill. It's immediately north. It is a contaminated site, and we have been advancing our proposals for redevelopment of the site into what we believe will manifest itself as a true gateway to Galt. We've got a hotel and a condominium building, 2 towers. It takes up the entire site. So right from the toe of slope of the GRCA berm to Water Street. And right now, we are approaching the 3-year time frame for being in the environmental approval process. We're not there yet. So when Mr. Scheels and Mr. Robson talk about the protracted time frames associated with these developments, I can stand right behind them and concur. It is just immensely time-consuming, immensely frustrating, and anxiety-provoking. So we're excited about the project. We'd be even more excited if we can get out of that approvals process and get into remediation and development. That will not likely occur for another couple of years, I think, by the time we get through the site plan process. So it's frustrating, but the killer would be, and we just found out about this rather late in your process, would be the removal or dismantling of the Brownfield Incentive Program and the removal of the core exemptions. That would put our project in serious jeopardy in the near to midterm. And I don't think the city will want to see that, and we certainly don't want to see it. The hotel itself is a wonderful complementary use to the Cambridge Mill. We would probably satisfy 40% occupancy on that hotel at any given moment just by the people that we bring into the Cambridge Mill. The hotel, that's a no-brainer. Or I'm sorry, the condominium, 185 units. It adds to that threshold of population that helps those downtown cores turn around. We're committed to delivering that as well. So it is reassuring to us that the City of Cambridge, obviously undergoing their development charge review, is considering maintaining those core exemptions. I can't state that categorically, but I believe that to be true. That helps, but we really need the region to step in and do the same. Boy, so much of my presentation has been taken over by Mr. Scheels and Mr. Robson. This is just fantastic. I have to thank them for that. I also would like to offer my congratulations to this group for the wonderful achievement on the ION. That's magnificent. I was sat on the Public Advisory Committee for that project, and even in that small capacity, it really is gratifying to see that finally come forward. So I've made my request. I'm just asking for the Brownfield Incentive Program to be maintained in its current form and the core exemptions to be applied to all 3 cores in Cambridge. I say that because I think Hespeler, because it doesn't benefit directly from the ION delivery, is going to probably need those incentives in place longer than the other 2 cores. So once again, the Cambridge market is different. It's softer than Kitchener-Waterloo right now by 15 to 20%. So as a developer, when we look at our numbers to see if a project is viable, we're getting to a no-go decision on that front in Cambridge faster than we get elsewhere in the region. It is not yet benefited from what I call the ION effect. We're waiting with bated breath to see that ION phase 2 become a reality. And I think we need these incentives in place because they will provide a really interesting catalyst to uptake when the ION does become a reality. And when I say reality, I mean funding fully secured and ready to go to tender. I think the other guys had mentioned dialogue, communication. That's important, and I hate to be scrambling this close to you having to adopt a bylaw And when we're struggling with the magnitude of issues we are on these fronts, we need to maintain an open dialogue throughout the course of the next 5 years. If we're going to run these projects and these incentives through for another 5 year to the next bylaw review period, we need to have dialogue with staff. And we've done this before. I was a member of the steering committee that put together the Brownfield Incentive Program. And we had wonderful participation from the industry, developers, consultants, builders. The region was here with planning staff, finance, and waste management. And that's a bunch of smart people around a table who worked out a program which I believe has been very effective. And it delivers tremendous differences in the assessment values for these properties. I know there was an appetite from Mr. Verbanovic, I believe, to hear some numbers. I can share our example in Cambridge of the difference between our current tax rate and the projected impact assessment. We haven't had an impact assessment, but we've done a model to show what it would be post-development. And it's staggering. This delivers revenue to both the city and the region in staggering difference to what it is today. So right now, we currently pay the city $4,500 and change per year. The region gets a whopping $6,500. Post-development, those numbers rise to $513,000 to the city and $723,000 to the region. So, to my mind, looking at the tax assessment, it just makes sense that it's good investment on the part of the region to support these programs, because at the end of the day, you've got some serious cash coming back into your coffers as well. So, I think brownfield development and redevelopment in general in the cores has always been somewhat of a partnership between government and the development industry. We both have to invest, we both have to wait for the returns, but when the returns come in community improvement, economic health, and tax revenue, the revenues, and these returns are robust, and it's certainly worth the wait. So we believe in the future of Cambridge. We're committed to the community. It adds a valuable yet distinct difference to the flavor of the region, and that can't be overlooked and shouldn't be overlooked. So it just needs a bit of time and a bit of a nudge, and we're looking for your assistance to help provide that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blackmere. Thank you very much. We have no questions. I appreciate you coming in, and I think it's fair to say everyone in Regional Council believes in the future of the city of Cambridge as well. So
good.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Tony Lamatina. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. Feels like bedtime, actually. It's been too long. I am indeed pleased to be here, and I'm going to keep my remarks at a high level. I have no intention of getting into the weeds. There's been a lot of good feedback thus far. And I'm just going to characterize what I think is the relevant competitive environment, and then just make some comments about being a willing host community for investment. So if you will oblige. I love that slide. From a kind of North American standpoint, it is a fiercely competitive, hyper-competitive environment. And some of the things that we're having to contend with, it was already mentioned that we're nearing the end of actually the longest economic expansion cycle in the last 100 years, right? So, you know, unless things have dramatically changed, you know, all the indicators seem to be okay, you know, unemployment, which is a lagging indicator, and profits are healthy, and GDP growth. But chances are we don't have another 10 years of this cycle to extend. The Trump tax cuts from 35% to 21%. You heard Vic Fidel yesterday talk about the impact on the MER, the marginal effective tax rate. We don't talk about it a lot, but the repatriation tax break, which basically reduces the taxation for U.S. multinationals that have about $3 trillion overseas and used to use that money to invest in different markets. That's been knocked down to 15.5%. And in the last year, about $500 billion has been repatriated, and that means less money from U.S. multinationals to invest abroad. Very fierce competition, especially in the Great Lakes states and the Southeast U.S. for automotive, aerospace, agri-food, generally speaking, advanced manufacturing. And in addition to those macro challenges, there are also right-to-work states, issues with energy costs, property tax abatement, and other municipal incentives like training and hiring credits that we don't offer in the province of Ontario and municipalities cannot offer because of the Municipal Act. I just wanted to remind folks that there's really 4 pillars to investment decision-making: the market opportunity, cost structure, talent, and incentives. Those remain the key pillars. And companies ranging from Trimac in Woolwich to OpenText in Waterloo get weekly pitches from economic development agencies from U.S. states or governors to relocate their headquarters for a crazy amount of incentives. And that's just the competitive environment that we deal with. I think it was Mark's presentation, but it was noted that supply chains these days don't require as much closeology. And by that I mean, as you don't actually have to be a kilometer away from the Toyota plant in Cambridge, because just-in-time production mitigates that. And so you don't have to keep inventory or locate near an OEM. And so that 200-kilometer radius is important, especially if we want to attract some high-margin, high-value-added suppliers for the new Lexus NX models that are coming to Cambridge. Our reputation as a business-friendly, willing host community for new investment is only as good as our businesses, the ones that are here and the new ones coming, and their financial partners say it is. And my preference is always, I like to tell my team, and I try to live by, do more, talk less. I'd rather spend less time talking about RDCs and more time finding qualified industrial opportunities and landing them in the region. So a couple of things that I think are really important as far as our business tone, and it's not always easy for governments, and I spent some time at the provincial level, but I think a less legalistic, process-oriented approach and more stakeholder-centric approach to posting new RDC reports or draft bylaws. Chair Strickland, you said on a couple of times, the only thing that was posted was the report, which included the maximum permissible rates. And that's really kind of when you're saying we didn't propose it, you're almost losing the battle by having to say that. So there's got to be a better way to do that that's not strictly, adhering to a legalistic process says we post it. Business-friendly means we always put ourselves in our clients' shoes first and foremost. Everyone understands that, we're going to get what we pay for as far as services, but, payers want value for money, and the long game and the benefits of, real taxation and short-termism need to be brought into the mix. So it's been kind of inferred, but I don't think anyone's actually said that industrial employment is more important and valuable than office retail. And it actually tends to be lower density and is disproportionately affected by higher DCs. And that's simply because the denominator changes pretty dramatically for an industrial versus commercial. Bottom line is we need good manufacturing blue-collar jobs. We all can't be software engineers or economic developers. We actually need that type of employment to balance social and economic life in the region. And then the last thing I would say is, we can definitely learn from the past, but when we have these considerations at these critical junctures, let's focus on those parts of Waterloo region that require some TLC and a real priority focus, like the airport lands, like the east side lands. And then the last piece is, I like to quote Warren Buffett from time to time. He likes to say that we need to avoid impossible business situations because the situation always wins and can take years to reverse. And so the fundamentals in terms of the cost structure really matter. And if you put a great willing host community and a brilliant economic development team, and I'm far from brilliant, and you put it up against an impossible business situation, that's the impossible business situation is always going to win, and it'll just make things very challenging for us. So, essentially, what I think happened on the 24th when the Watson report was posted was that, a few hours after we had 300 people at the Holiday Inn doing a regional outlook with brokers who are key intermediaries in the commercial real estate world, I think it was a CBRE event, the reaction was, pretty widespread, and it was instant. I had numerous phone calls, scrambling for context. And if I'm doing that, I think the real estate firms, their intermediaries, their investors were doing the same thing. So, and we pivoted, you make the phone calls, Matthew, Rod, what's going on? Well, it's just a draft. There's going to be consultations, relax, everything's okay. And then you communicate that, and the feedback to me and my staff was, if it's just a draft, then kind of why put it out there without full contextual pillars? So I'm not saying that the front page should have said we are not recommending 164%, but the narrative became, and I think arguably still seems to be, that the region wants to increase industrial DCs by 164% from this rate to that rate. And hey, Tony, investors are going to put on the brakes. We need to do something. So here we are. So this is complex stuff. So, and I think a number of people have tried, but it's really easy to kind of come up with a bottom line from the standpoint of investment decision makers. So let's simplify it. Milton, Guelph, Hamilton, they're all basically a 20 to 30 minute drive from parts of Waterloo region. Includes Stratford, Brantford, Woodstock, even London and Windsor as far as important supply chains for advanced manufacturing. How do we match up? That's really the key consideration, as well as the impact on what I think is one of the most important prospective sites in all of southwestern Ontario, and I would say the province agrees. The east side lands and the ORC lands and the area around YKF, our airport, really important. And so let's keep in mind that if we're playing the long game, we are pretty late in the cycle. So let's be keenly aware of what the impact of any RDC regime will have on those projects actually getting some important advanced development. The province sent a letter a couple of months ago to heads of council about something called the Job Sites Challenge or Mega Sites Challenge. I think we have a unique opportunity because we have been approached to provide input into that, because servicing can be both complex and expensive. And I know from my interaction with the region, just the cost of servicing our airport lands will be significant. So I think let's together change the narrative. We definitely want more advanced manufacturing, more industrial employment, and I think there's an opportunity here. There's no kind of magic bullet, but whatever we land on, competitive rate increase phased over X number of years, probably back-ended, unless there's a really good reason to front-end it, and I don't see it, and we'll be fine, because there's still a lot to market in the region. But that's what I wanted to say, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Banovic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Tony, for coming in and really making a comprehensive presentation. And I think you bring an interesting lens to it. Obviously you're not representing business interests specifically, but more in a general sense. And I think you make a lot of strong points around this issue. As you know, one of the strengths of our local economy has been the fact that it has been as diverse as it is, and we still have 18 to 20% in the manufacturing sector. We've been able to get funding through the feds in terms of the advanced manufacturing supercluster and so on. Does this potentially jeopardize some of the successes that we might see down the road if we don't tread carefully on this issue in terms of new businesses locating in this region?
Well, let's use this opportunity to change the narrative, right? So we're not going to increase RDCs by 164%, right? People are nodding, so we're not going to do that. I think that we need to start communicating, and I certainly will be, the willingness of this community to find a reasonable model to implement. I don't think it actually jeopardizes expansion projects, but what it might do is, it might cause some decision makers and their financiers to start touching the brakes, right? And that's always something like that kind of uncertainty needs to be nipped in the bud. And I also believe that when you have the province now reviewing its direct business support programs, things like the Jobs and Prosperity Fund, the Southwestern Ontario Development Fund, actually at a roundtable Vic Fidele, it might have been yesterday, it was yesterday, it seems like it was such a long time ago, talked about the need to get input on the kinds of ROI that the province is going to seek when it gives a grant to a company, especially because it's in a deficit situation. So I think that we need to tread carefully, but let's make sure that we continue to convey to investors and our existing anchors that want to expand that we're an investment-friendly community, and that council recognizes that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question, Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Madam Mr. Chair.
It's late, but I'm not quite there
reading
yet.
my notes from earlier. Tony, I have to admit I'm a little bit surprised at some of the reaction tonight to the communication process. And I guess I would have thought that the development industry would know the Development Charge Act maybe even better than we know the Development Charge Act. And so the obligation for us to publish full rates. And I'm interested, I'm curious as to whether or not you, but maybe other members of the audience would know how other municipalities have dealt with that. I think this is my 6th Regional Development Charge bylaw review, and I chaired 3 or 4 of them as Councillor Strickland is doing now. And I don't remember the controversy
ever being this painful
this time
okay.
as we did other time, but I have advocated and supported the 50% industrial discount each and every time, and I'm doing that again in the task force that we had a meeting earlier tonight. So why wouldn't our record stand for itself when those rates were published? And why would people not have said, but hang on, the region's record on the industrial rate at least is a 50% discount, and there is an obligation to publish the full rate that's in the Act. I'd be interested in knowing, maybe you don't know, maybe others know, how other municipalities deal with that. How else can you communicate that so the waters are calmed and all the phone calls and the frenzy gets created? Because I believe at the end of the day we'll have a fairly satisfactory result of this problem. How do we avoid it in the future?
So that's a very insightful question. I've been struggling with it myself because, and I think part of it is my not being here for the last 10 or 20 years and being able to say, well, that can't be the case, guys, relax. Waterloo region is known for being, very investor friendly, and so I short of I don't believe you, but here are the published rates, and I think that so part of it's just my own inability to fully grasp that this is normal process, and actually I sat down with Craig yesterday or a couple of days ago, probably Monday, and he walked me through kind of what is typically done. And from a process standpoint, there are I think a couple of things could be, this is the range of options available, and we start with the very clear indication that this is the maximum permissible rate. And we're going to have a conversation about what the right rate should be in Waterloo Region because we care about X, Y, and Z. So I think that I know that there's, you've got to get it out by a couple, 2 months before you actually get the bylaw passed. But I think there's got to be a better way than what happened. And, I take some responsibility in not being keenly aware of kind of the municipality's legal requirements per the Municipal Act and the Development Charge Act in particular. But between this kind of legalistic, have to do this process and communicating a report essentially with some recommendations and some key modeling that may be some type of process to bring key stakeholders in the investment developer community together to kind of walk them through the range of assumptions might make sense. So maybe it's all about the summary and the way it's communicated.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would ask the other developers in the room who, in most cases, are working in other municipalities as well.
How do they do it?
And dealing with development charges in other contexts, if they have any suggestions how other municipalities communicate this so that we can avoid the excitement. I did meet with Mr. Kindrachuk a week or two ago and tried to peel him off the ceiling at the Tim Hortons down the street. So I understand.
I think he did because he's here tonight somewhere, right? So, yeah.
I understand the problems, and what he indicated to me was shocking, in terms of some of the issues that he had to deal with and potential business losses as a result of this, which to me, I'm sitting there listening to that, and I said, but that's probably not going to be the rate.
Yeah.
I kind of know already where we might be heading with this, but we have to go through a process. And I don't know how we go through the process without that kind of collateral damage. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'm all ears.
Yeah, this is a learn by doing moment for me as well, and I think that it's going to be important to look at how other municipalities across the province, across the country, in fact, deal with these types of challenges. It's got to be a better way.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And just in terms of the communication, I think for tonight, we clearly indicated, and you're suggesting quite strongly that whatever we do with development charges, we have an eye to remaining competitive. And I think further what Councillor Galloway has said, throughout the past 5 or 6 reiterations of this bylaw, we've carefully considered competitiveness. And we're always in that middle range from the charts you've seen tonight, from the background study and other charts as well. So that's something that I guess that we've kind of taken for granted. We've gone through this process that the industry should be aware that this is the published rate, but we are going to be competitive based on our past track record. So duly noted, and in terms of the immediate communication, we are going to be competitive when we settle on a number, and we have another 5 years to get it right before the next one.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Mr. Schiedel, Alan Schiedel. Welcome.
Thank you. All righty. Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of council. I'm Alan Schiedel, local business owner of Schiedel Construction in Cambridge. I'm here tonight to represent a couple hundred angry clients, developers, and local business owners that employ more than thousands of people in our region. When they read this report and then saw later a copy that was communicated, draft bylaw, I reiterate draft because I think that's where the communication got misinterpreted. Draft means proposed in my English book, but astronomical development charge increases, in particular proposed 164% increase to industrial and 34% increase to non-residential, is just not sustainable and outraged my clientele. I had a petition sent out. Just in one day, I got over a couple hundred petitions signed of how outraged, and they interpreted the same way I did. I just have a couple slides. I just want to paint a financial picture of what some of my clients go through in terms of planning of where they want to build. So this is a slide showing a typical 20,000 square foot non-residential commercial building, what the proposed rates would look like, and the total fees if they were to build in the region. You see in the red, those are the new proposed rates. And in the yellow column shows the savings of if they were to build elsewhere, in particular Guelph, Brantford, and Woodstock, being significantly less. Like, what client of mine wouldn't want to drive 10 minutes to Guelph and save $218,000, or 30 minutes to Woodstock and save $372,000? The second slide shows a typical non-residential industrial building for 20,000 square feet. And this was the worst, as other delegates have said already. They increased 164% in the cities in our region, and they increased 177% to the township for industrial development charges. This is, again, not sustainable, and if passed, I fear will halt development, in particular industrial, in our region. This third slide is just going over what a typical 20,000 square foot industrial building would cost. And I chose Cambridge. So $2.4 million to build the building. You need about 1.5 acres. To build it on, that'll cost $0.6 million. That varies obviously on your location. So you have $3 million investment. Now the fund comes to raising funds for a mortgage and paying for a deposit. A commercial mortgage is way different than a residential mortgage. Residential is significantly less, probably typically around 5% deposit. And a commercial mortgage can vary hugely all the way up to 40%. So let's say 30% is a deposit. You got 0.9 million. And then you take the proposed total development charges, city, region, school boards, at 0.46. So now the owner's investment has to come up with a cash of 1.36 million before they go forward with this. Most of my clients take 5 to 10 years to raise this kind of money to be able to build a new building. How can they plan for 164% increases? Like, inflation is 2%. Like, I can't forecast 164%. So with my petition, the 100 people that signed it, we recommend, firstly, that keep the existing 50% reduced development fees for industrial with a max 10% increase per year. This will promote good paying jobs in the region. And if the proposed rates go ahead, I said already, will greatly halt industrial development probably for at least 5 to 10 years. Secondly, propose increasing the non-residential development charge rate by max 10% per year. So closing remarks, let's be a place where we want a startup company to move to, manufacturing or commercial industrial business owners to build. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schiedel. Appreciate that. Thanks for coming in, and your presentation, as well as everyone else's tonight, will be kept by the clerk and used to be reviewed to help formulate our final report and to provide input to the steering committee. So thanks so much.
Okay. I have a copy of all these petitions. Who would I give that to?
Maybe the clerk, Van, maybe you could grab that from Mr. Schiedel. That'd be great. Or Chris, Ms. Fletcher will grab that from you, Mr. Schiedel.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, no questions.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. The next delegation is Heather Campbell. Ms. Campbell, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Chair, regional council members, appreciate the opportunity to provide input on the proposed development charge increases. So I'm a partner at Vive Development Corporation. We primarily focus on apartment development, and most of our work to date has been in central Kitchener. So what I'd like to speak about this evening are the impacts of, I understand they're not proposed, but the discussed development charge increases on housing supply and housing prices. A little bit of discussion about who actually bears the cost of these increased development charges. And then I also want to discuss the revenue model that's been put forward and how we think that changes in supply may impact the revenue projections. So to start, we do believe that increased development charges will negatively impact the housing market. So the proposed significant increases in development charges will decrease the supply of new housing units. So as I mentioned, we have been developing in downtown Kitchener. So for us as a downtown core developer, we're seeing apartment development charges go from zero, because there has been an exemption in the core, all the way up to what's recommended of over $15,000 per unit. So that's a very significant increase. It's particularly a very significant increase on lower cost units. So if we're looking at $15,000 as a percentage of a $300,000 housing unit, that makes up a much larger proportion of cost than it does for a $600,000 or $1 million housing unit. So we strongly believe that reduced supply, especially at the lower end of the market, will occur as a result of these increased development charges. And we know that reducing supply in any market leads to an increased price of goods that are being sold. So we want to emphasize the impacts across different segments of the housing market and how rental housing and lower cost housing will be impacted differently than higher cost housing with these proposed changes. As we know, these types of distributional effects will place a higher purchase and rental cost burden on lower income families in our community. And we know that we already face problems with affordability in housing in our community, so we just want to ensure that these types of impacts are taken into account when finalizing the proposed development charges. So who bears the burden of development charge increases? There's a lot of debate in the academic community about whether development charges are actually paid for by developers or whether developers pass on these costs to renters and purchasers. Ultimately, it depends on the specifics of the individual market in which the development is occurring. So either way, the outcome, whether they're borne by housing developers or pass through to consumers, is that we end up seeing an increase in housing prices. So from a developer's perspective, if costs of development goes up, obviously margins get squeezed and fewer projects will move forward. If, as we currently see in the Kitchener-Waterloo and Region of Waterloo market, where supply is tight and there's a lot of demand for housing, it becomes much easier for developers to pass on these costs right through to renters and purchasers of housing. So that creates a direct increase in housing prices, likely by the amount of development charge increases, which again disproportionately impacts purchasers and renters of lower cost units relative to higher income individuals or people purchasing or renting higher cost units. So we think that this needs to be more fully considered. The distributional impacts of a flat development charge needs to be more fully considered before reports are finalized. Furthermore, the revenue model would seem to assume that increased prices and increased costs of development do not impact the number of new units supplied to the market. It seems to imply that those two factors, increased prices of development, does not have any impact of reducing supply. So as I've argued, I believe, and we believe, that it will have an impact on reducing supply, in which case, if the number of new housing units is reduced as a result of development charge increases, then total revenue will not increase per budget expectations, and funding goals will fall short. So we think that's really important to consider, and that potentially there needs to be more analysis done on the sensitivity of supply to these proposed increases in development charges. So in summary, we believe that the region needs to more fully consider the distributional impacts of development charge increases, particularly on housing affordability. We believe that increasing development charges, as noted in the proposal, will exacerbate the housing affordability crisis that our community currently faces, and will not necessarily achieve regional and other municipal revenue objectives. So if we think that this will impact housing affordability, what can we do about it? So what we're suggesting is more gradual increases to soften the blow to housing affordability and housing supply. We also recommend reviewing the PTE and PPB DC credits. We've brought on an engineer who's thoroughly reviewed the study so far, and we believe that these credits are about 20% too low for infrastructure services. And it's important to note that this is about the same percentage increase as the proposed regional DC increase for central apartments. Another suggestion is to offer DC credits for specific types of housing. So I mentioned that we are a rental housing provider. Rental housing units our rental housing units tend to appeal to the attainable mid to lower end of the market. And we expect the ability to bring more of those types of housing units onto the market to be significantly impacted by the DC increase discussed to date. And we're also recommending reinstating the DC exemption in central neighborhoods. We currently have 200 apartment units that we are currently in the process of building in central Kitchener that would not have moved forward without the DC exemption that has been in place and just ended at the end of February. So that is all I have this evening. I really appreciate your time and look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Campbell. Thanks so much for coming in. We have no questions, so thanks. Appreciate your input and your slide deck. Okay, we have a delegation, Alicia Monteith. Alicia? Welcome, Alicia. I'm sad to inform you that as you registered late, you only have 5 minutes. Are you okay with that?
I am fine with that. I know it's been a long evening and you still have a ways to go at this point. So
Okay.
I know it's also been an exciting evening, so I'm happy to share my comments at this time.
Thank you.
Chair, members of committee, my name is Alicia Monteith. I'm a urban planner with Prica Global Enterprises. So we're here this evening to share our concerns regarding the outlined and highest rates proposed in the background study. I'll try to keep my points short, as you've heard quite a breadth of information and comments from my colleagues in the area. So some background, Prica Global, along with our sister companies, provide construction, architecture and design, and project management services, primarily for residential properties in the Waterloo region, although at this time we've recently acquired several employment lands, particularly Raython and Steelcraft properties in Waterloo region. And I'll circle back around to how some of the comments that we received tonight will impact those properties in particular. But from a residential perspective, we have a strong tie to our local community. We have 16 years of experience in the development field in Waterloo region, and we serviced and managed 20 properties, with several coming online in the next few years. So a significant proportion of our developments are purpose-built rental accommodations. Circling back to the information that was provided by the province on May 2nd with regards to Bill 108, we recognize that there is a 2% vacancy rate and rental accommodations throughout the province, and that number is accurately reflected in this Waterloo region in particular. With regards to our holdings, we're seeing a vacancy rate in and about 1%, which is less than the average for the region. Development charges can be more onerous on the rental developments, as discussed by Ms. Campbell previously, because in particular, we can't offset those upfront costs with the sale of units as you do with freeholder condo. So in our experience, the Waterloo market is experiencing the increased costs of goods and materials, a shortage in qualified contractors, which is expected to worsen over the coming times with the retirement of the baby boomers, and resulting in a significant increase in our construction costs. Combine this with a potential significant increase to the development charges, otherwise puts viable rental developments in jeopardy. In this case, we need to reevaluate whether or not the resulting rents will increase, and as we've heard, we pass along those costs to ensure that our projects move forward and that these units do become available for members of our community. Or we reevaluate the rental tenure of the project and move to either condominium or whatever may be more viable in that case, and that's bringing offline potential rental units available for members of the community. So Waterloo Region is expected to experience substantial growth over the last 16 years, especially with the ION coming online now in phase 2, hopefully in the future. We are projected to grow, and within cities, we're seeing a transition from the suburban form that we've previously recognized to an urban, more dense form, and this is necessary for the viability of the region. It is the responsibility of the region, the cities, the municipalities, in partnership with the development community to ensure that projected growth is accommodated through a full range of housing, employment, institutional, and recreational options. And this must be done in a sustainable, efficient, and responsible form. So development charges, we recognize, are necessary to offset the cost of growth of development and ensure that appropriate services and infrastructure are available and in working order. When establishing the new bylaw, we ask that the committee consider the potential negative impacts that you've heard this evening with regards to the availability for the market to provide a range of housing types and tenures when considering the potential increase to the development charges within the cities as well as the townships, and what impact this may have on the variety of members of our community, particularly middle income and lower income. Coming back around to the employment lands that we're talking about, the employment lands that we are reviewing, we're at the stage where we have acquired them and we are going through detailed design. So the impacts that you guys are considering at this time, our company is in what has been referred to by other of my colleagues, that initial design stage, where at this point we acquired those lands accommodating the programming that was in effect at the time. And if that program and that funding is no longer available, we're lucky enough at this point to be able to provide that flexibility in our design and how we accommodate that to a certain extent, but we can say that it will have a significant impact on the type of form and type of development that we're able to provide. So it's just something that I hoped we were able to kind of contribute to that we're at that stage where we're not so far into the process, but we can say that it will have an impact on the form, the size, the type of development that we're going to accommodate on those sites. So I wanted to ask that the committee consider the proposed changes and their respective with regards to Bill 108, and I know that staff will be reporting back on that matter, and the proposed direction and whether or not some of those things we should consider at this time. So we respectfully request that the committee reconsider the potential extent of the development charges, and we are happy to hear that we're in support of supporting the competitiveness of the region. So thank you for hearing my comments, and if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Monteith. You did excellent on the timing there, so we really appreciate that. Are there any questions from committee members? Seeing none, okay, thank you very much. We appreciate that. So this is a public meeting, so I have a duty. That's the conclusion of our formal registered delegations. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to address committee and council on this matter? Calling a second time, anyone in the audience? A third and final time? to speak on this matter to committee and council? Seeing none, we're going to start to wrap it up, and I'll just turn it over to Mr. Dyer to explain what the next steps are going to be. Mr. Dyer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a number of items that we'll be working on over the next few weeks. There are some additional meetings with the steering committee that will happen. Obviously, some additional staff analysis on the rates, and a series of policies relating to, I would say, in no particular order, the non-residential rate structure, exemptions, discounts, area rating, the Brownfield Financial Incentive Program, and redevelopment credits. We will continue our analysis and provide input to the province on Bill 108. And as I said earlier, we're expecting to bring a report forward to committee on May the 28th, or perhaps more than one report to committees on May the 28th in order to meet the June 1st submission deadline. Our schedule, as we indicated earlier, would have recommendations coming to the Administration and Finance Committee on June the 18th, and the planned council approval date is June 26th. And just again, as a reminder, that our existing bylaw has a July 31st expiry date. Just two other perhaps comments relating to input and feedback and communication over the next 6 weeks or so. We have some information on development charges up on the Engage Waterloo Region site. That site will be open for input on the development charges process, I believe, until May 21st. So I would encourage people to provide input through that process. And we also maintain, I think what we thought was a fairly extensive mailing list of interested parties, people who we have communicated with, who received copies of the draft report, who received copies of the background study when it came out. If there's anybody here who would like to have their name and email address added to that list, I would just ask you to speak with Mr. Fady or Ms. Gray right up at the top over here. Leave them a business card, leave them your name. We'll do our best to keep you up to date on our progress as we move towards a new bylaw.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. See, we're improving communication as we go along. So, and I say that somewhat in light spirits, but really appreciate everyone coming in tonight and sharing your input and your views on this public policy matter, and it's something that we obviously take quite seriously as a council. I really like to thank all the delegations and all the audience members, and I especially like to thank those members of the audience who are in attendance for the 7 p.m. council meeting. So thanks everyone for your indulgence tonight. It truly was democracy in action. Your input's very much appreciated. It's going to help shape our bylaw. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Nowak, Chair Redmond, all those in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you very much.
Tony.